when I got to the North Pole, I had this feeling that, you're in this location. You feel you shouldn't be there, but yet you never feel more alive. And it was that aspect of putting yourself under physical pressure and being in an extreme location that something clicked with me, as I say, and I realized this is what I should be doing.
That was the voice of Richard Donavan, ultra-marathon runner, extreme event organizer. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee, welcoming you to our latest Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew. This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by the Irish Heritage Tree Program. Celebrate your Irish roots by planting native trees for family and friends in the beautiful Golden Vale of Ireland. Go to irishheritagetree.com and use the exclusive discount code today. It's IrishStew10 for 10% off. That code again is IrishStew and the numeral 10. Keep the heritage of Ireland green and growing by going to irishheritagetree.com.
Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty, and welcome to another episode of the Irish Stew podcast. I'm joined in our studio with John Lee. John, Connus will too.
Was that Maltese that you were speaking, Martin? It sounded vaguely familiar, but I thought we did that in our last episode.
I truly lack an Italian accent under Ambassador Giovanni Buttigieg, so no, it wasn't Maltese, But so what I asked you is how are you? And your answer should be, well, hopefully it's good. You'll say Time go ma.
Time go ma.
Time go ma. Okay,
Time
so that's
go ma. How was that?
That's your couple of fuckle for today.
I'd be very careful when I say that phrase, but let's keep the Irish lessons going episode to episode. But let's race on to our guest today, Martin. Who we have in store?
Oh, you really just had to drop in a bad pun there. Clearly,
it's called the segue.
Yes. Okay, so. Our next guest is a man of astonishing athletic accomplishment. He's run across continents and in some of the most extreme environments on the planet. He holds a number of mind-boggling records, but let's cite just this one. 7 marathons on 7 continents in less than 5 days. To be actually precise, 4 days, 22 hours, and 3 minutes. Richard Donavan. Welcome to Irish Stew.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Richard, I'm just going to kick this off by asking, tell me about a perfect day of running. And that doesn't have to be, one of your extreme efforts. It could be, anything. So tell me about a perfect day.
A perfect day of running for me would be an open road, nice weather, and no distractions. So, as you mentioned, I've run across certain places like America, for example, and I've been on what was called the loneliest road in America one year, which is a road through Nevada. And people told me before I got to that road that I'd be bored out of my mind, that it would kill me psychologically, that I'd encounter nothing for long periods of time. And in fact, that was the beauty of it all, because with running, you're alone with your thoughts and it's an escape from the outside world. And there's no better way to do it than being by yourself.
Were vultures circling?
Yes, they were actually. Actually, funny story. When I ran across the States through Nevada, the time I mentioned, it was in 2015. And I started to run at night. It was very hot. And I remember there was a full moon out one particular night, and I could hear dogs nearby or coyotes or whatever. And I hadn't encountered them. Obviously, we don't have them in Ireland. So this was a new one for me. I didn't know whether they were dangerous or anything else. Didn't particularly care, but still, the next thing I saw shadows going by a lot. And naturally, I started looking around. I said, oh, there's a pack of dogs or something here going for me. And it was only after a while I decided to look up and it was the shadows of vultures that were obviously I shouldn't have been hanging around at that point.
Welcome to Nevada.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the message that says, human, you shouldn't be here.
Yeah, or we're waiting.
Hey, before we move on from that, just a quick question, because I looked at some video of you on that road. In that kind of landscape, you don't get any sense that you're making any progress, right? Those mountains don't seem to get any off on the horizon, don't seem to get any closer after hours of running.
No, that's true. And, when you start a transcontinental run, for example, let's say the last one I did last year, you're standing in Boston and you've got to go all the way over to California. It's quite a long way. And, and you literally, sometimes people say it's important to look at the big picture. In those kind of runs, it's actually, you don't look at the big picture because it's overwhelming. Because things don't get closer very quickly. And, the dot on the map doesn't move at first. I remember, you look at your progress every few days and you say, crikey, I haven't really gone there in the sense of the country at large, and it takes a long time for that dot to move across. Mm-hmm. And so you literally live in the moment. You don't worry about the mountains coming closer. You just, it's zen-like. You have to embrace that. If you don't embrace it voluntarily, it's forced on you. Mm-hmm. And you surrender to it and you just move along.
Yeah, speaking about tracking progress, do you carry like a GPS, or what do you actually carry with you when you're doing one of these runs? Are you like a digital nerd, or are you the actual opposite?
I am the opposite of a digital. Mm-hmm. But I do carry a GPS watch. And the reason for that is just simply it records the fact that I ran the distance and it tells me how far I've run each day. But that's about the extent of my use of technical stuff.
So you're not constantly checking your watch and say, oh, I did.
No, I'm entirely the opposite. I don't upload stuff onto Strava or whatever people use. I don't care about any of that stuff. And I think people are too preoccupied with that and it complicates matters. And kind of, I suppose in a sense, you lose some of your freedom, which is part of why I would do a run like that, in that you're becoming answerable to others. You have a task that's other than the run itself.
Okay, so I certainly want to come back to this because I'm fascinated by the question of why you do what you do. And we want to revisit that. But I want to roll the clock back. You're from Galway. Yep. Tell me about your Galway childhood. Where does the whole marathon and how does that marathon thing fit in there? Was that ever like a long-term thing, or
no?
Let's start off with your childhood first.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. I mean, I grew up in Galway, and I'm from Mervue, which is on the east side of Galway, a working-class neighbourhood. I grew up in the 70s. I never really had a big interest in running until I saw my brother run, who was a good runner. And so he ended up being an Olympian and that. So I always had this interest in running. So during my teenage years, I ran for school. I wasn't very good. I might have won iconic championships, top 6 in Ireland at best. I was kind of one of those guys who'd get to the All-Ireland schools final, but I'd finish between 6th and 12th, that kind of a thing. Whereas my brother, for example, would be just setting records left, right, and centre. But I had this interest. I was okay at running. I enjoyed running. I was competitive enough at it. I played rugby as well. And I think like many people, I kind of drifted away from it in my 20s. I went to college, stopped running altogether. And then it was the death of my parents that brought me back into it, that reignited an interest in the sport.
So your parents, as I understand it, died in... your mom died in 2000, your father in 1998, in close proximity to each other.
Yeah.
And I imagine for anybody to lose a parent, regardless of the relationship, is traumatic in many cases, and certainly a milestone.
Yeah, I was in my 30s and my parents had lived to their late 70s. And you might say to yourself, well, they had a good inning and all that. But, it's still a shock when your parents die. And in my case, both my parents were buried on the same day. which seems unusual because my father died 2 years before. But he gave his body to science in the interim. And by a complete coincidence, his body was released for burial on the day my mother died. So it's a very unusual situation where you bury both your parents on the same day, despite the 2-year difference.
Yeah. It sounds like there was kind of a moment of clarity in this highly stressed situation. It sounds akin to what you find when you're running.
That's exactly it. So, obviously you become a little bit introspective when a trauma like that happens, or, through the death of anybody. So in my case, I was working as an economist at the time. So when I did go through college, pulled away from running and all that kind of stuff, I was simultaneously going down an academic route. So I'd done a master's in economics. I'd done another one in the US. And I was kind of going, I was working as a consultant. But as I've often said to people, just because you're good at something doesn't mean it's good for you. I was probably, arguably I was a good economist, but it wasn't for me, and I think a lot of people go down the line, of some kind of structure, of something they've, done through college, and they continue along that way and perhaps realize late in life, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And for me, looking at my parents being buried and all that kind of brought a moment, all right, where I said, what am I doing? It's going to be all over at some point, blah, blah, blah. And for me, I decided to get back in, to do something in their memory first. And I went back into something that I thought was me as a person, but that I had ignored for a long period of time. And that was adventure, exploration, all those kind of things. I think things that many kids have in their mind, if you ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't think they're going to say an economist. I think they're going to say, an explorer or an astronaut or something that sounds perhaps outrageous in your adult life. But I think I tapped back into something there that said I should be doing this. And I think when I started to get back into running originally to do something in my parents' memory, I realized that was the click. I defaulted back into something I thought I should be doing.
So then the challenge with that is okay, you are on a conventional track, making money, putting bread on the table, and now all of a sudden you're going to say, you know what? I'm going to go run in the South Pole. Okay. So let me ask you the ugly question. Fine, you want to go on adventure, but there is an economic reality within which we all operate. How do those pieces fit together?
Well, what happened is I managed to merge both of them together. And as I say, again, by default, not by design, it wasn't any kind of grand plan. I kind of went with the flow. So what happened was when my parents died, I decided I'd run a marathon on every continent in their memory and raise money for a couple of charities. And so I started training from scratch. I had no idea what I was doing. It had been years since I'd run. I'd never run really marathons or anything like that. And so I started training to do this. And I went down to the South Pole. I was still working as an economist. But as an economist, I was not in a structure anyway. I was working for myself. So, it wasn't a big leap to do something else. The same, kind of qualities are needed, which is, a risk-taking and all of that kind of stuff when you work for yourself. But I did. So there was this overlap where I was running and working as an economist for about a year or two. So initially I went down in 2002 to the South Pole. I ran the first ever South Pole Marathon down there, happened to win it. And even though the North Pole is not on a continent and was not in my schedule for that year, I heard that the second place finisher was probably going to run a marathon at the North Pole and was going to head up through Canada to run a marathon up there. I heard a rumor of it. So he would have been the first marathoner at both poles. So that kind of got, I suppose there's always a competitive aspect to polar stuff throughout history. And I kind of said, well, I'm going to get up there before him. And I figured a way up there with Russians at the time who were setting up a floating camp at the North Pole during the month of April. Got up there, ran a marathon. No one had ever run a marathon at the North Pole before. And this was just probably 10 weeks after I'd won the first South Pole Marathon. And the kind of, when I got to the North Pole, I had this feeling that, you're in this location. You feel you shouldn't be there, but yet you never feel more alive. And it was that aspect of putting yourself under physical pressure and being in an extreme location that something clicked with me, as I say, and I realized this is what I should be doing. And I thought I would set it up as an event for others to do, that there must be many like-minded people who maybe can't go on an expedition for 6 months or something like that, but would have a dream to go to a location and do something physical there. So I actually set about setting up a North Pole Marathon, and everything grew from there into other events.
Richard, I read a little account of that, and your North Pole trek seemed incredibly improvisational. and you talked about, kind of interest in the sort of polar races. And I've been fascinated with the story of the Amundsen and Scott competing expeditions to the South Pole. And first of all, just, how forbidding the landscape sounds, but also that sort of less planned out approach of Amundsen was vastly superior to Scott's almost like military maneuvers. To get was Scott's Amundsen's approach is much less complicated, much more streamlined, and much more successful.
Yeah. I think, you're right there. The improvisation and the lack of rigidity in your approach and an ability to be flexible. And, that's what I try to bring even when I just run across a continent or something like that. People think there has to be a lot of planning, for things you do yourself. And I think that's very limiting. I think the most important thing is the vision. And many people make decisions nowadays on a fear process. What if, or maybe I should do that some other time. I'm not ready this year, and they start going down to the fine details of, I need this kind of a crew. I need whatever else. When you ask me about technical things, am I a tech nerd? No. And this is one of the reasons why. I think, for example, so running across America, I didn't know who my support driver was going to be until 2 weeks before I did it last year. I only had one support driver. I knew all I wanted to do was run about 40 miles a day. And I didn't think very much beyond that. Just do the 40 miles, find somewhere to stay, start where you finished the next day and do another 40. And eventually you'll get across. And I think that's, through our adult years, we learn a process of, fear, of not making decisions, not doing things. Whereas, as I said, as a kid, you just see the vision and you go for it. And I think I try to be a kid. I try to not look at all the things that can go wrong and just say, if I want to do this, I'll go for it. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But I'm as flexible and I'll improvise and I'll do whatever it takes to just make it happen. And I think that attracts, I don't know, an environment where things do happen. And people will gravitate towards you that will help you to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And, and that's my approach. There is no in-depth kind of analysis and look at, for example, diet. I don't care what I'm going to take or eat or drink when I go across the States. I didn't take one energy gel the last time I did. I was drinking fountain Coke and eating whatever I came across. And, the weight will fall off you when you run that distance, and that's it. And, so don't overcomplicate things. And I think, and that's what I did with the original North Pole. And I learned that that's the way you should do things. And they'll come easier that way.
So that works well as an individual. What you're describing to me is almost like a hacker. So talk to me about hacking into Russia, if you will, to get to the North Pole. How do you even get that up and running? Because literally, you did that within a couple of months of being in the South Pole. This is clearly you're talking about somewhat seat of the pants. But how do you ingratiate yourself to people that are willing to support you in doing this kind of stuff?
It was very much seat of the pants. I actually got my route into Russia through American friends who happened to know, who were familiar with the polar, in general way, with polar travel. And it was still quite new at this time, 2002, the idea of building a camp at the North Pole. And so I was one of the first with these particular Russians. And so, yeah, it just took a lot of emails, basically. And then, and a lot of, I suppose, leaps of faith, in that at one point I was supposed to go to Moscow, fly over the North Pole, parachute in with Russian soldiers and help them make a camp. And then it changed suddenly to, I would go to Svalbard, which is an archipelago off the coast of Norway. I would fly up there on an small Antonov jet that would land on a makeshift runway on the ice. And that would be the technical flight where they check that you can actually land on the ice. And that's the route I actually went. So it was very much seat of the pants. I ended up just going to this archipelago called Svalbard, meeting a bunch of Russians who didn't speak English, who brought me to the North Pole. I helped them build a camp up there. And the next thing I ran a marathon with a GPS, as I do, and that recorded the distance. And the next thing I had the first marathon at the North Pole done. But it was, the whole arrangements around the North Pole are actually quite fascinating, because the North Pole is on an ocean. It's on the Arctic Ocean, and there is no land there. And what happens is, around the time of the spring equinox, so around the 20th of March, the sun obviously comes up the North Pole, the 6 months of constant daylight. And normally what would happen is a couple of helicopters take off from Siberia with enough fuel for one way to 90 degrees north. They look for a piece of ice that's robust enough for a plane to land on it. So they touch down there, and they can tell by the maturity of the ice, by the color of it and things like this. And then what happens is they build a camp and they flatten out a runway on the ice of just a few hundred meters. And then these jets take off from Svalbard, land on that, and people run a marathon. That's how I have organized a marathon over the years.
On Irish Stew, we often get into this little conversation about maybe playing the Irish card, how the Irish accent's a door opener. Do you feel that helped you out navigating through the Russians? If it was an American coming at them, maybe they wouldn't have been as receptive.
Yeah, well, actually, at the start of it, I said that there was an American probably going up there. So I tapped into the Cold War rivalry. But I think, I think having a sense of humor, and they recognize you're doing things on the fly. And I think they very much appreciated that, that I was going up by myself. I didn't have a big team with me and TV cameras or anything else. So I think they liked that. And then over the years, I developed a big friendship with, these hardy people who could make things happen. And I know at the moment what's going on in the world. The ordinary Russian is tainted in a certain way, but I've always found them to be amazing people. And in fact, we've worked with Ukrainians and Russians up there. It's just an international area, and but just amazing people.
And all these people, in the polar expeditions, and also you describe what you saw running across the country. All these people who lend a helping hand, they become part of the story. They're part of they kind of share in your success, I would think.
Very much, the one thing I've learned from traveling around and being out in the open road, let's say by yourself, where you're very vulnerable. You're vulnerable to traffic. You're vulnerable to everything. People respond to that. And there's good people everywhere, every state, every country. That's the one thing you learn. There are good people everywhere. running across America last year, people would say to you, somebody's going to shoot you. There's all these, stereotypes depending where you're from, blue states, red states, all this kind of thing. It just doesn't happen in reality. There are pictures that are painted, of danger. Like I say, going back to this whole thing, things can happen. In reality, the opposite happens. More of a chance of getting into trouble walking down the street in Galway than running across the whole of the US. And I mean that in a kind of fun way. It's just great people. I remember I was going through the Navajo Nation, around as I headed west when I was in Arizona and that. And some of the Navajo Indians would come out and give me water. They kind of got to know me, and it went through the neighborhood for miles and miles and miles. And people, suddenly a car would stop and somebody would come out with water and say, we know what you're doing, and just the friendship was amazing. Beautiful. And that was everywhere, and especially, when it's like the Forrest Gump thing where people think Forrest has some great insight into the world, and they'll, because he's running across the country, and people will end up telling you their life story in 10 minutes where they mightn't have told somebody else because, I guess you're just in a pair of shorts and a singlet. There are no social barriers. They just see you in the moment running from one place to another. And it just breaks down all the barriers.
Yeah, I think if you want to connect with people, one of the most powerful things you can do is show your own vulnerability. And especially in men, because I think a lot of times we're conditioned to be, present that tough exterior. And what you're basically saying is actually, if you really want to connect with people, it's the actual opposite. But before we move you into the dry west of America, I just want to ask a couple more questions about polar stuff. Now, traditionally in a marathon, you run from, there's like New York City Marathon, for example, you run through the 5 boroughs and there's a course laid out. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about course building. It strikes me that it's very different on the Arctic polar ice versus down in Antarctica, which is actually landmass.
So there is a big difference. So the North Pole, for example, as I mentioned, is on the Arctic Ocean, which there is no land. There's 14,000 feet of sea under about 6 foot of ice. So you're running on that 6 foot of ice. And that terrain is, because you're on a moving ocean, there are hillocks of ice. The terrain is not flat. And there are a number of dangers. First of all, the ice can open up and expose the ocean below. And, so they're called leads, breaks in the ice. Polar bears are going that far north. They usedn't, but polar bears are appearing up there and they're looking for seals. And, they actually, if they see
stray runners.
Yeah, they see somebody running away. If they see somebody running away, that's tempting. And they will run after you. So there are real dangers. And then, of course, there's the cold. And typically, it could be minus 30 Celsius to minus 40 Celsius. And, for American listeners, minus 40 Celsius is minus 40 Fahrenheit. That's where they meet. And so it's very cold. So that, you've got to dress a different way for a start. So you're not wearing shorts and a singlet. You're wearing layers of clothing. And the layers of clothing, they're not very heavy because one of the problems of running in cold weather is actually overheating. So if you wear heavy clothing and you stop running or doing some kind of physical activity, that will, you'll sweat a lot and that will freeze. And that's where you have a problem. So the key to running in any cold environment is layers of clothing where you can ventilate and kind of control your temperature as much as possible while keeping your peripherals warm, like your fingers, your face, etc. So typically it's layers of clothing where you have a base layer that takes sweat from your body, kind of a light fleece layer on your torso to keep you warm, and then a wind shell. It's like a tracksuit top. And usually that will have zips on it to ventilate. So that's the kind of gear you wear. You're obviously not on a road at the North Pole. So what I would do as a race organizer is I'd make out a track with little flags that people follow. So I would do that when I arrive. I would typically keep that track, it'd be a multi-loop course. You can't start 26 miles from the pole and run to the pole because of the polar bear threat, the breaks in the ice, and also the fact you are on an ocean and it's moving. And it can move quite quickly. So you could be running to the pole and being pushed away from it at the same time. So it could take forever to get there. So you typically do a short loop, keep everybody safe. Unlike where I do things a little bit seat of the pants, when I'm planning for others, that's a different matter. And I do take care of all those details around that, safety, everything else. Because I'm dealing with other people's lives. But typically it's a short circuit, multiple loop circuit, could be 8 to 10 loops. And the idea is it's not a survival race. It's an actual running race in an extreme location. People get a chance to earn their way there. Many of them raise lots of money for charity. And they get that sense of adventure I mentioned at the start that I think becomes addictive. They go somewhere, they do something different, and they tap into that thing I mentioned about kids, that innate sense of adventure and exploration I think we all have and can sometimes lose. So this is kind of like a modern day adventure for people. They're the kind of events I've set up that I think a lot of people gravitate towards.
You're kind of leaning into my next question, which is kind of, I referred it to as a hacker approach towards these running expeditions that you did personally, but it's a whole different kettle of fish when you're organizing a race on behalf of others. And there's a whole economic reality that sits behind that. So just for our listeners, you organized not only the North Pole Marathon, but I think you have involvement with the Antarctic Ice Marathon, the Volcano Marathon, the World Marathon Challenge. So these are all represents enormous logistic challenges. And talk to me about the business end of things, the logistics end. What are things that we should know?
They're all events I've set up, many years ago. I think the first North Pole Marathon, as I said, I ran myself in 2002, set up the first race in 2003. And then I set up an Antarctic Ice Marathon at the opposite end of the Earth, I think in 2005. And then eventually set up a Volcano and World Marathon Challenge, which are things I'm kind of moving away from now to get into doing stuff in space. But I'm sure I'll talk about that in a minute. But the logistics behind those events are very big. So the World Marathon Challenge would be 7 marathons on 7 continents in 7 days. So there is, as you mentioned, an economic reality to it and a logistical reality to it, that it's very difficult to accomplish. So with the World Marathon Challenge, I'm trying to get people around the world within 168 hours from the start to the finish. And that includes running a marathon and traveling on each continent. So the logistics of that, I would always start it in Antarctica, because Antarctica is the place you're most likely to have a delay. So you don't want to go around and run 6 continents and then find you can't fly into Antarctica because there's terrible weather and the whole thing is gone. So we always start there. So that's where the clock starts. So soon as, so you can see straight away there has to be a degree of flexibility around the timing of the other races, because you can never be sure because of weather when you will start in Antarctica. So what I do is we head in there. It's inherently expensive to operate. It's inherently expensive to operate in Antarctica alone, especially in the interior, because you can't just ship fuel in there, for example, which is necessary. It's got to be flown in. So very few people go to the interior of the continent. And I always have my first marathon in there. So the logistics, let's say, of the last World Marathon Challenge I organized would be that I would meet people in Cape Town in South Africa. I would use an Aleutian jet, which is an intercontinental kind of converted cargo plane, to bring them into a base camp in Antarctica. And so that could be like 4,500 kilometers away from South Africa. We start the first race there, a very simple, basic course on the runway, and we get moving. So we have the first race there. They wear the gear I mentioned. Then we come back to Cape Town. I'd have local organizers there who would set up the second race and have it ready. And, we have a very quick turnaround, several hours, but roughly 13 hours in each location to operate the race, get to the airport and move on. So, we get to Cape Town. The temperature turnaround is huge, of course, in January. And then we move on. So, in terms of costs, it would involve, chartering planes basically to go around the world and do this. So you've got to come up with a price and take a risk, like with anything else, on how many people are going to enter this race. And I think what I had created over the years were events that generated their own press. So I've never had to take out an advertisement anywhere. I kind of had the idea, these are kind of crazy events. People will get attracted to them. They generate press all around the world. People do them for a variety of reasons. They may be different than your conventional marathon, like we've mentioned, but they still attract a diverse range of people like any marathon. They're not elite athletes. They can be, I had guys in their 70s running, I had a guy 80 this year run the World Marathon Challenge. So you get this, really diverse range of people doing it for different reasons, sometimes raising millions for charity. And so as you go, so I know these events generate interest in themselves and generate entry. So I can kind of tell intuitively that it's going to work financially.
Richard, you're kind of talking about, stories there. You're really traveling around the world with a plane load of stories. There are people you mentioned raising money for all kinds of charities. Do you have a story or two you could share about the people you are traveling with and running with around the world?
Well, let's say I mentioned the oldest guy this year, a guy called Dan Little from Oklahoma. So he ran the World Marathon Challenge when he was 76 in 2019, and he told me he was going to come back. And he's, I often describe him as the type of person, let's say back in the 70s and 80s when you wanted to go to America. He's the type of person you looked at and said, I need to get over there. This kind of capable of everything. You can tell by him throughout his life. He's, self-sufficient kind of man. Lives on a ranch. He's a lawyer. And just, he has no limits. He doesn't care about his age or anything else. He just, like I said, he makes things happen. He's young at heart. And as he said to me at the end of it, what he loves about doing an event like this is, he said, you're half dead, but never more alive, which is something I touched on as well.
Well, can I just interrupt there for a second? Because I noticed, like, on your Twitter profile, you say a man barely alive.
That was a take on the $6 million man. You remember when he was rebuilt? I've had a couple of surgeries and stuff like that. So kind of
I gotcha.
But it is, it goes back to that idea that, man barely alive. So, there's, people like, I had a wheelchair competitor this year and a hand cycle competitor. And the wheelchair competitor I had, his name, it was called William Tan. He's from Singapore. And I actually brought him to the North Pole in 2007 when people said you could never do a marathon at the North Pole, you're in a wheelchair or whatever. And I said, no, you can. And I brought him up there and I had him do a marathon on the runway as opposed to going over the hillocks of ice, which was still extremely difficult in a wheelchair because you can't freewheel. So you learn these things yourself. You know, you had ordinary wheelchair tires, and you had to, for every inch, you had to push so hard to make every inch of that. It took hours and hours and hours to finish a marathon up there. But he came around, he came back and did this. And, you know, and then you have, you know, you can have elite athletes, guys who've, you know, I think the record is 2 hours, 45 minutes for the average time to run 7 marathons on 7 continents in 7 days. An American called Mike Wardian, which is incredible. That was his average time over the 7 days. So you've got this, you know, you got people who had cancer, who've lost loved ones, who, you know, all kinds of reasons for doing it. And then just, you know, personally want to take on a challenge themselves. And I think I've found that these events become very much a dividing line in their lives, you know, especially if it's their first event. Very much like when I did my first ones, where they described their lives in terms of pre-pole and post-pole, that everything changes. And I think it changes because they take on a lot of uncertainty, an awful lot of uncertainty, and go to a place, have all the fears you should have in doing that, and realize, you know what, it happened, I'm okay. And then they start to do other things and evaluate things in a different way. And as I say, less of the fear in the decision making. There's a lot more, and go with the flow and it'll work out.
You know, listening to you talk about some of your clients, I'm also reminded that both your Transamerica runs were done on behalf of and in memory of a gentleman called Alvin Matthews.
Yeah,
can you tell me a little bit about that?
So Alvin was we call him a client. I don't even like using that word because everybody becomes friends. But he participated. He was a participant in a couple of my races. He had run in Antarctica and at the North Pole. Then he had a work-related accident where he had a fall, and he became paralyzed. So he went from being this active athlete to suddenly finding himself in a wheelchair, and which is very obviously huge change in his life. So in 2015, I decided I would run across America and try to raise funds for him to help with everything, and more as well, to involve him in everything again. You know, bring him back into the world of running and all that, because I sensed he would feel so isolated, you know, that this life has changed. So it was great. And then in 2021, he actually just died suddenly a couple of days after I was talking to him. And I decided to do it in his memory, the last one in 2022. So I brought his ashes across the country and gave them back to his mother in California.
Richard, that's a very poignant moment for you, I'm sure, and meaningful one for his mother.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was incredible. You know, I was worried about the ashes every day, obviously, when I was entrusted with these. But yeah, it was lovely to see her at the finish. Highly emotional, obviously.
Well, I think there's got to be a book in your future. There's a lot of amazing stories coming out here. But we mentioned the future. Let's take you into the future, the final frontier. Where are you going next?
I used to think Antarctica was the final frontier. I always had a goal to run across Antarctica, you know, and maybe I will someday. But during the whole COVID situation, I was thinking to myself, I have to start doing something off this planet. And, as many people were probably thinking at the time, I was having enough of it. And I had a friend, one of the people I met during these trips was a guy called Raphael Rocken. He's from Germany, and he happens to be a space expert. And he knew I think I registered a domain, Lunar Marathon or Mars Marathon once, and I mentioned years ago in an interview, you know, should think about space at some point. And then that became a bit of a reality as we spoke in March, I think, or during 2020. where he had become this bit of a space expert. And he said, "Are you still interested?" And I said, "I sure am." And so together we've set up what we call Space Athletics Federation. We've just trademarked that in the US. And as people often say to me, it's important to pee on the lamppost first. We said, why don't we pick,
stake your claim
for space and athletics? So we set up the Space Athletics Federation. He had contacts with many companies around the world. And so we decided to have our first event on a treadmill at the edge of space with a company called Space Perspective. We're sending up hydrogen balloons to 100-something thousand feet. So you have the blackness of space around you and the Earth down below. So our first event is planned for 2025. It's only 2 years away. And where we'll have somebody, we're not going to say it yet, but we're not entirely sure yet, but somebody do, let's say, a sub 4 minute mile on a treadmill off Earth, or a very fast marathon, or whatever it may be. And we're going to take it from there. We have other plans going into the future for other events in space, on space stations, and then a variety of things on Earth that will involve kids to have those aspirations, of going up there.
We should definitely connect you with one of our guests, Katie Coleman, an Irish-American astronaut who we had join us. She'd be fascinated about this.
Yeah.
As are we. And sounds like we'll get you back in a few years to update.
Everybody's talking about humans going into space, and obviously this is happening again, with plans to go to the moon in 2025. And kind of our view was, well, humanity needs to go into space. And humanity means the arts, sport, and everything else. And we said, we'll get sporting people up there and we'll start to do things like that are different.
I think of that, one of the early scenes on the spaceship on 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the guy is jogging around the entire loop upside down.
I watched it recently, actually.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring you back down to earth, more mundane matters. You mentioned in passing that you were considering running across Antarctica, and I've read that unfortunately a serious injury intervened. I think was the reason why that really wasn't possible. So for a man that runs thousands of kilometers and miles, etc., it's hardly a surprise that you suffered injury.
Yeah.
Tell us about your injury story.
Well, I had run across America in 2015, then Europe in 2016, done South America in 2017, and I was planning to run across Antarctica later that year. Because no one had ever run across Antarctica. And in September, I was out in a routine run here in Galway. It was in good shape. And, because very often I have a healthy dislike for training, I may as well tell you. So a lot of the transcontinental runs are training in themselves. But anyway, I was out in a routine run, and the next thing, my knee went from under me. It just gave way. And I tried to get moving again. I said, this is different than normal. Sometimes things happen, but I knew this was somewhat catastrophic. And so I had MRIs done pretty quickly, and it just revealed a lot of stuff under the bonnet and that I was unaware of. I had two torn medial meniscus. I had very badly torn patella tendons, which hurt the front of the knee, torn ligaments, bone bruising, bone blunting, just a variety of things in both knees. So many that I didn't know what to do. And what had happened was I'd obviously developed pain tolerance over the years. And, even though I always was aware of some pain, it was tolerable, literally. But I think, and then it just tipped over. And then when I looked, it just revealed the scope of what was wrong. So I initially looked for stem cells, as a way of because they could be injected all over the place and see if it would work to fix anything. And it did fix my patella tendons, which was amazing. So stem cells are effectively cells that don't have a function. You take them from, my marrow, you re-inject them, and they become the cells that are needed. That's the theory behind it. And they actually fixed my patella tendons entirely, which had been a chronic issue for many years and were very, very badly torn. But they didn't fix the kind of hardware of the bones and that, So one of my knees, my left knee, was particularly sore. My right knee, even though it had the same issues, had no pain. So I went for a conventional medial meniscectomy where they trim it to see if that would work in 2018. It didn't. And I was going around I was trying all kinds of things, anti-inflammatory diets, different kinds of exercises, all kinds of injections to try and get rid of this pain, and it wouldn't go, and I couldn't run. So eventually, and then I saw a surgeon in Ireland who said, I was looking at a knee replay. He said, "Do you know a crunchy bar?" And I said, "Yeah." Well, he said, "That's what your knee looks like underneath." It's just all these pockets of problems, So, but then I found a doctor in California, a surgeon, and called Kevin Stone, and he had an exact opposite approach. He just said, I remember the surgeon in Galway saying to me, or a surgeon who I happened to meet in Galway, he said to me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to run across America again or do something like that." And he was laughing, I said, "It's just not going to happen, So the surgeon talked to the surgeon in the US, and he goes, "What do you want?" Must be a standard question. And I said, "I wanted to run across America again." And he said, "I'll get you back doing that." And he had looked at the MRIs remotely, and he came up with a solution, which was a kind of a partial knee replacement with robotic surgery and some various tweaks he had developed. Literally fixed the knee, never a problem since. And that was 2019. But in 2021, my right knee had developed pain. So I never got a chance to do anything when I had to have my right leg done as well. So literally that was April 2021. And in April, I couldn't walk half a mile without a significant limp. I'd been injured at that point for 4 years. And in April 2022, I started my run across the US, no knee pain. So it was incredible. It was like miraculous. And this guy just made it happen.
One more question before we proceed on to our shameless plug segment. You've run in all sorts of places around the world. From what I can see, you've been in the Sahel in North Africa. You've been out in the Himalayas. You've been back and forth across the Andes. Tell me about your favorite place to run.
It's hard. One of my favorite experiences was the Amazon jungle. And I ran a race there probably 2006 or something like that. And it was one of those kind of races, a multi-day race where you carry your stuff on your back and, you survive. And the funny thing was that race was a disaster for me in terms of performance. I had kidney failure after a couple of days. I kept going for a bit. I had acute renal failure. I had to get my kidneys going again and all that. But I think for me, it was one of my favorites in the sense that I learned so much from it. And this was an environment you were running, before I went to the jungle, I had my vision at that time of what it was going to be was, running with these beautiful trees around you and, running free. But it turned out, you're in these swampy areas. Everything in the jungle was trying to kill you. And I discovered an Achilles heel for me, which was humidity, that even though I liked heat, humidity was a killer for me. So I think sometimes you can take a lot. I mean, it was such an experience for me, sleeping in hammocks, everything that happened there, which tended to be against me. And yet, perversely, it was one of my favorite things that I did. Not that I'd be in a rush back. but but that I actually had that experience where it was so raw, so different to what I'd done before in polar regions or anything else. And so, you can have I suppose, a good experience in a place that might have been bad for you on the surface, if you learn from it and appreciate that it was crazy. And,
I think that's a great place to wrap up today, Richard. Finding, I guess, more than a silver lining in adversity, and looking back at that and saying that was a great time. So I think there's a lot to learn here. You've given me some hope for the future. And speaking of the future again, what would you like to tell our listeners about as we move into our shameless plug?
Oh, I think I'd like to raise, some awareness about the Triumph Foundation, which was the organization I tried to raise money for Alvin Matthews, who I said had become paralyzed. So they're a California-based organization, and they help people who, suddenly find themselves overnight in a position where they can't walk anymore, which is obviously a horrendous thing to happen. And this organization, whether they're army vets, people who've been in an accident, anything else. And the thing I've discovered over the years talking to people like that is the most important thing is to get back living very quickly, and get back into the world with this new reality. And that's what they help people do. So
what's the name again of the foundation?
It's called the Triumph Foundation.
Triumph
Foundation, yeah. So it's triumph-foundation.org. Great organization. A big shout out to them for what they do.
That's a perfect endorsement, and we'll include the link in our show notes. And Richard, fantastic discussion. I can't do one damn thing that you've been doing, but you inspire me to take the next step.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Richard. Hey, John, great conversation with Richard Donavan. One of the things that stood out to me was his approach towards these ultra distance runs that he does. And he said something to the effect of that he approaches things like a child, with the vision of a child, because as we get older, we get more cautious. We're always trying to protect against bad things happening. We tend to over-prepare, and over-preparation gets in the way of doing the kind of things that Richard likes to do.
Yeah, I was struck, Martin. I think you would agree. We have a lot of guests on here on Irish Stew who are incredibly accomplished, and many of them have done things I can barely imagine doing. Let's say win a Pulitzer like Barbara Walsh, lead a massive healthcare system like Michael Dowling, compete in the Olympics like Patty McGrath and Deirdre Ryan, and going into space like astronaut Katie Coleman. But I don't think we have had anybody on who's accomplished anything more unimaginably extreme, to me at least, than Richard Donavan. Here's a guy, for him, the Boston Marathon was just a way to stretch his legs before running across the country. And 7 marathons on 7 continents in 7 days wasn't extreme enough, so he did it in under 5. My God.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.